What comes out above LDL cholesterol for causing or being associated with, because we can't say causation, it's an observational study, for CVD mortality? Ah, cholesterol lowering medication. Hi, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Medic podcast. Now, in today's episode, we are discussing this UK Biobank study that people are talking about on Reddit and saying that this is a smoking gun for LDL cholesterol being not a risk factor for heart disease. Is that true? Well, a little bit more to the story, of course. So let's have a little look at this study. We're going to go through it. We're going to talk about this LDL cholesterol, why people think this is a smoking gun against cholesterol being the cause of heart disease, which, look, I don't agree. Cholesterol is, I think, not the cause of heart disease. Oxidized LDL is a much bigger risk factor than LDL, but that's not what this study is actually looking at. Let's have a quick look at this study before we get too sidetracked. So this was a study in the degree of joint risk factor control and hazard of mortality in diabetes patients, a matched cohort study in UK Biobank by Zhu et al. In BMC Medicine. And I'll put the link in the episode description, of course, like always, so you guys can have a look. This is a free article. Anybody can get access to this. Let's just have a little look at the abstract, but we are going to delve more into it than just the abstract. So people are talking about this being a smoking gun for LDL not being the cause of heart disease, not caring about LDL. Who the hell cares? Because it was the lowest risk factor for mortality in these diabetes patients. But there's more to the story. Background of this paper: diabetes patients are higher risk for mortality than the general population. We know this. We know this is true. However, little is known about whether the excess mortality risk associated with diabetes could be mitigated or nullified via controlling for risk factors. Well, yeah, I think probably most of us could probably estimate that, yeah, it probably could be. I'm not sure it takes a rocket scientist, or in this case, a researcher or a team of researchers, who I'm sure are very intelligent, of course, to kind of work this one out. But they obviously wanted to look at the degree of how much they can kind of improve the risk. I mean, I would argue that the best way to improve the risk in patients who have type 2 diabetes is to change their diet, go on a low carb ketogenic diet, and cure their type 2 diabetes rather than messing around with these other things. But that's just me. Let's carry on with the study though before I get too sidetracked. So, methods. We included 18,535 diabetes patients and 91,745 matched individuals without diabetes, without baseline cancer or cardiovascular disease, followed up from 2006 to 2021. So, okay, good point there. 15 years. That's quite a long time. This wasn't done over 3 months. This wasn't done over 6 months. This was done over 15 years. That's quite a long time, and that adds some certain robustness to this study. The other thing we should look at here is the numbers. So 18,000, I'm going to highlight it on the screen for those watching on YouTube. Hello. 18,535 diabetes patients, 91,000 matched individuals. So this study looked at well over 100,000 patients. Pretty much just about 110, just over 110,000 people. That's a big study. But as with always, there's more to the story. So this looked at the UK Biobank. That's important. This is not a randomized control trial. This is not a case control study. This is an epidemiological observational study. Now that means two things. Number one, we can't draw causality. Number two, it's going to be prone to bias and lots of potential issues. So we do have to take these things into consideration, though, as we said, it was a pretty big study. We're going to just quickly look at the what they actually looked at here. So they looked at things like glycated hemoglobin, that's HbA1c, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, albuminuria, that's albumin leaking into the urine from the kidneys or protein in the urine, smoking status, and LDL cholesterol, as few of the other things we're going to get down to into the lower down. They also used this thing called the Townsend Deprivation Index, which I'll explain what that means a little bit later on. I'm going to go to the risks and things a little bit later, but basically what they found, long and short of it, was the more risks that you can control for, the lower the risk of diabetes, and in terms of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and so on. And if you can control for 5 or more risk factors, the risk pretty much comes down to almost the baseline risk of non-diabetic patients. Now, that's not saying zero risk. That's just saying non-diabetic. Now, bearing in mind, non-diabetics still have a huge risk for things like cardiovascular disease. It's just they're not as high as patients with diabetes. So let's go down the study. Let's have a little look at this. Again, this is a free study. Everyone can get access to this. Now, I'm not going to go through this entire study because, again, it's 11 pages long. It's not super long, but we don't need to go through every single part of this study. I want to pick out some key points. Definition of risk factors, again, control, you can have a look at this, but this is a really important part. I don't really mind that much about other things. So glycated hemoglobin was established as a glycated hemoglobin being less than 53 millimoles per liter. That's actually not very high. So this is low density lipoprotein C, otherwise known as LDL, otherwise known as cholesterol, were analyzed. They looked at an LDL concentration below 2.5 for this study. That's really important because people talking about, oh, this is a smoking gun, LDL doesn't cause heart disease, who cares about LDL? No, not really very true there. This study is basically saying, and we're going to come down to the results later, but it essentially shows LDL was the lowest risk factor concern for pretty much everything they looked at. Not everything, but mostly everything. But they used an LDL of below 2.5. They didn't just look at LDL in total. They looked at LDL below 2.5. That's important. We're not talking about LDLs of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20, 25. I've done episodes on this recently. Some carnivores having 20, 25 LDL cholesterol. Crazy high numbers. We're not talking about that. We're talking about 2.5. That's pretty low. That's way lower than what most people in the average population are going to have as far as LDL cholesterol is concerned. So remember that LDL of less than 2.5. They also looked at, just microalbumin of 6.7 milligrams per liter and so on. We don't really need to know too much about all of these other bits and pieces. Let's go down to the outcomes and variables and so on. I'm pretty much just going to go down because this is all just tables and data and nobody really wants to look at all of these things. We want to get down to the graphs, and this is what people are going to be talking about. So this first set of graphs is a little bit confusing to start with, but I'll explain what's actually happening here. So they looked at all-cause mortality, they looked at cancer mortality, they looked at CVD, that's cardiovascular disease mortality, and other mortality, so anything else that wasn't included in either cancer or cardiovascular disease. Now, this is a slightly confusing graph because the cumulative hazard, the hazard ratio essentially being how much more likely are you to get problems or get, in this case, basically death, that's the outcome they've looked at in these graphs, versus the number of days on the x-axis that you were studied for and how many risk factors you had. Now, you would think that more risk factors means more risk of death. It's a bit confusing. I had to kind of work this one out. What they're actually looking at is this is the number of risk factors that were controlled in patients who had type 2 diabetes on the study. That's why the more risk factors, and again, people in YouTube can see this, the podcast I'll have to explain, there's various graphs here. Again, link to the paper in the episode description. Less than one risk factor was the highest hazard mortality, a hazard ratio, and 5 risk factors was the lowest in pretty much most things. Interestingly, for CVD mortality, other mortality, and cancer mortality, controlling for 4 risk factors actually was a lower hazard ratio than controlling 5. Very interesting. Not quite sure why that would be, but anyway, that's a very interesting, perhaps further conversation. What this is saying is the more risk factors you can control for, the lower your risk is. That's why it's kind of the wrong way around in a way. But this is not really what I want to be talking about in today's episode. I want to go down. What I want to look at is these graphs here. So again, link to the episode description. I'm on page, where are we? I'm on page 8 at this point. Okay, if you were listening to the podcast and reading along. This is the results that people are talking about on Reddit and other places I've seen people talking about it. All-cause mortality, cancer mortality, CVD mortality, and other mortality. What were the biggest and the smallest risk factors? Well, for all-cause mortality, LDL cholesterol is, you see it on the screen here, right at the bottom, 0. Basically, according to this graph, 0 increasing importance, less than glycated hemoglobin. Interesting. So in people with diabetes, HbA1c wasn't actually a big risk factor. Interesting. Bearing in mind, they looked at people with HbA1c of below, I think it was 56, which is not actually very high. So I don't know why they've picked these weird kind of numbers, weirdly low. This might be very different if we were looking at HbA1cs of like 10%, LDLs of 10, 15, 20. Might be a very different story. But in this paper, LDL cholesterol for all-cause mortality was the lowest risk factor. Glycated hemoglobin was actually very low as well. Hypertension was very low. Interesting, because these are all known risk factors for heart disease. Physical activity, exercise, came in very low, as well as alcohol. Interestingly, healthy diet, quote unquote, healthy diet, was a bigger risk factor than LDL cholesterol. Very interesting. And what did they determine was a healthy diet? And why was it a risk factor for heart disease? That makes no sense. Well, let's go back to the study. What did they determine as healthy diet? So I've gone back to page 3 now, where they're actually looking at the other variables and the definitions. Healthy diet score was created, I'm reading from the study now. Healthy diet score was created according to the consumption of vegetables, fruits, fishes, processed meats, and unprocessed meat. So yeah, healthy diet was actually a bigger risk factor than LDL cholesterol. Very interesting. But again, the LDL cholesterol was less than 2.5. I don't think this is the smoking gun that people think it is. Let's go back to the study though. The biggest risk factor for all-cause mortality was not LDL cholesterol. It wasn't even smoking. It was albuminuria. That's albumin, or basically protein, in the urine. Smoking was a fairly close second, and then down the list, quite a big drop there, was antihypertensive medication, then diabetes medication, and then obesity. Interesting, cholesterol lowering medication was number 6 on all-cause mortality. Interesting. Cholesterol lowering medication was a bigger risk factor than high blood pressure, was a bigger risk factor than alcohol, was a bigger risk factor than diabetes duration. So does that mean statins increase the risk of all-cause mortality? Well, it's an observational study. We can't draw causation. We can't really draw that conclusion, but this would make it look like cholesterol-lowering medication is a bigger risk factor for all-cause mortality than diabetes duration. That's pretty big. Diabetes type, healthy diet, whatever that is. Number of medications, and presumably they also mean poor diet within that. Number of medications, polypharmacy, alcohol consumption, physical activity or lack of, hypertension, which we know is a big risk factor for heart disease, HbA1c, which is a big risk factor for heart disease, and LDL cholesterol, which supposedly is a huge risk factor for heart disease. Now, again, look, LDL cholesterol below 2.5. I do have to keep saying that because we're not talking about LDLs of 10, 15, 20. We're talking about less than 2.5. But I just want to kind of hone in on this bit here. Cholesterol lowering medication, zoom in on the screen, was a bigger risk factor than cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and hypertension, physical activity or lack of, diabetes, basically combined. Cholesterol lowering medication was a bigger risk factor for all-cause mortality, almost the same as obesity. If we go over to cancer mortality, it gets even more confusing and interesting. So, LDL cholesterol, where are we now? LDL cholesterol, you can see on the screen here, for cancer mortality, is now about halfway up. Again, this is less than 2.5. Interesting. Well, what's above that? Cholesterol lowering medication is now above obesity or cancer mortality as a risk factor. Again, this is an observational study. We cannot draw causation. But does this mean that cholesterol lowering medication is a bigger increased risk for cancer than obesity? Yes, it would appear so. Bearing in mind, this was from 110,000 patients. Quite a lot of people. Wonder why that might be. Well, we know that statins, for example, which presumably most of these cholesterol lowering medications were statins, we know that they really reduce coenzyme Q10 in the body, which is pretty much one of our biggest, if not the biggest, antioxidant within the body. Isn't that interesting? We also know, of course, that cholesterol actually has a really important role within the body. And one of its roles is essentially as a repair mechanism or a firefighter, if you will. Now, if we think about cancer being a fire, well, surely we want firefighters to help to fight that fire. Cholesterol, we know, has a role in repairing, and this is why it's thought to be involved with heart disease, the so-called endothelial heart hypothesis, as opposed to Ansel Keys' garbage diet heart hypothesis. Sorry, I should keep my views to myself. I'm trying to keep this relatively scientific. The endothelial heart hypothesis basically says, well, inflammation, vascular damage is really what drives heart disease. LDL cholesterol comes along to try to repair that damage or deliver the cholesterol so the body can repair. The diet heart hypothesis says cholesterol causes heart disease, which we know it doesn't, because it doesn't cause heart disease, quote unquote, in veins. Veins are not that different to arteries. Heart disease only happens in arteries unless you transplant veins into the arterial system, like a bypass graft. Then you can get CVD, cardiovascular disease, in veins. So we know veins are not immune. Why don't veins get cardiovascular disease then? If cholesterol is the cause, surely it's floating around our veins as well. It should be causing cardiovascular disease in veins, but it doesn't. Only causes it where there's a lot of pressure. Pressure causes damage. Damage then needs to be repaired. Anyway, going back to the study, if we have no firefighters or very low levels of firefighters, low LDL cholesterol, less than 2.5, we're probably going to struggle to fight those fires. We're going to struggle to repair the damage that's being done by things like cancer. This may explain why LDL cholesterol actually being low is problematic for cancer. Again, problematic for all-cause mortality, but actually not that high. It was actually quite low, the LDL cholesterol. Interesting. Cholesterol-lowering medication was higher in cancer mortality than obesity, than diabetes duration, than hypertension, than LDL cholesterol itself, antihypertensive medications, healthy diet, and this Townsend index. What the Townsend index is basically a deprivation score, and they look at things like jobs, they look at things like home ownership, they look at things like car ownership and so on, debts and credit cards and all these other kind of factors that basically is a deprivation index. And what they're saying here is cholesterol lowering medications was a bigger risk factor than for cancer than all of that deprivation, and bigger than obesity, and bigger than diabetes duration, bigger than high blood pressure, and bigger than essentially alcohol and diet. Interesting. Let's go down to CVD mortality. That's cardiovascular disease. LDL cholesterol, which we are told all the time is the cause of heart disease. It's not, but let's keep it factual as far as this study is concerned. As far as CVD mortality, LDL cholesterol was number 4 on the list from the bottom. Again, this is an LDL cholesterol of less than 2.5. This is not a smoking gun that says LDL cholesterol doesn't matter, but it was very, very low if your LDL cholesterol is less than 2.5. Extremely low. Very interesting. I regularly, as a GP, get letters from cardiologists, who shall remain nameless, of course, otherwise they'll sue me. I don't want to get sued. All they say, all the time, repetitively, over and over again, ad nauseum, is pretty much, to paraphrase, all the patient needs to do is get their LDL cholesterol below 1.5. They're not even saying 2.5 anymore. They're now saying 1.5. And yet this is saying is if your LDL cholesterol, bring it up on the screen again, your LDL cholesterol is less than 2.5, this is a minuscule, minuscule risk factor. Why are we trying to drive LDL cholesterol down to obscenely low levels? Obscenely low levels that causes so many problems, as well as just the side effect of statins, of which there are many. And by the way, they also increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. NNT, number needed to treat, is about 315 off the top of my head. NNH, number needed to harm, is about 210. You're more likely to get type 2 diabetes from a statin than you are to prevent one non-fatal heart attack. Not great. Okay, let's go back to the paper. CVD mortality. What comes out above LDL cholesterol for causing or being associated with, because we can't say causation, it's an observational study, for CVD mortality? Cholesterol lowering medication, aka basically statins. Interesting. Statins, well, cholesterol lowering medications, are a bigger risk factor for CVD mortality, according to the UK Biobank, 100,000 patients, 110,000 patients. Cholesterol lowering medication is a bigger risk factor than diabetes duration. It's a bigger risk factor than high blood pressure. We know that's a big risk factor. It's a bigger risk factor than alcohol. It's a bigger risk factor than physical activity or lack of. And it's a bigger risk factor than LDL cholesterol. Again, less than 2.5. But it's almost as much of a risk factor as obesity. Fascinating. I think this cholesterol lowering medication is actually the really important part of this study, not the LDL cholesterol. But let's move on. Let's look at other mortality. Now, this is where we see some variation coming in. Townsend index, this is this deprivation score, is actually pretty high on the list now. Albuminuria is basically the top in every single category. Apart from cancer, actually, smoking is the highest there. Albuminuria is very low. And this is pretty much because if you've got albuminuria, basically your kidneys are kind of screwed already. They're kind of pretty damaged. So you're in a pretty bad shape already. But other mortality, not total, other mortality. Albuminuria was number one. After that, Townsend index. So deprivation score was very high. Interesting after that, number of medications, polypharmacy. Now, I'm going to do an episode coming up on this soon, basically about how this medical system is just completely broken. But I recently saw a patient, not my patient. I was on a weekend at the clinic. They were on, no lie, 35 medications. I'm just going to pause for effect there. Let that sink in. This patient was on 35 medications. 35. I haven't gone quiet. I haven't frozen. I'm just kind of, as I repeat it back to myself, I'm still kind of gobsmacked by this number. These were active medications. This wasn't like she's ever been prescribed them ever in the past, but this was active current medications. Now, I'm not criticizing her. I'm not criticizing her GP. No. Look, this patient has lots and lots of issues. They are probably benefiting from some, at least, of these medications. But there's no doubt this patient does not need 35 medications. There's no doubt there's going to be some interaction with these medications. It's absolutely insane to be on that level of medications. It's pretty standard now that we see people on at least 5 to 10 medications. I'm surprised now if I see someone on less than 5 medications as a new patient. When I was a medical student, or even as a GP back in England, this was like 6-7 years ago back in England, I would be surprised if I saw a patient on more than 3 medications. Now I'm surprised if I see them on less than 5. We used to have a term called polypharmacy. We still do. And it basically meant you were on lots of medications. That's actually defined as 3 or more medications. That's polypharmacy. I'm getting off topic here, but I think it's just an important point. We now have a term called hyperpolypharmacy, which sounds made up, but it's not. It's a genuine term. It means you're on more than 10 medications. This is deemed as excessive. What the heck is 35 medications? There isn't even a word for it. Anyway, it's insane. Let's go back to the study. Number of medications was a big risk factor here, as well as diabetes type and diabetes medications for other mortality. Interestingly, let's go down. Cholesterol lowering medication again appears on the list, and it's not number whatever 20. It's not the bottom of the list. Diet is actually the bottom of the list. Very interesting. Cholesterol is way down the list as well. Again, this is cholesterol less than 2.5, but still. Alcohol is below cholesterol lowering medication. Cholesterol lowering medications, basically statins, is a bigger risk factor for other mortality, not CVD, not cancer, than alcohol. Interesting. Cholesterol lowering medications is a bigger risk factor for cardiovascular disease and mortality than deprivation and hypertension and LDL cholesterol itself and alcohol. LDL cholesterol in terms of cancer, cholesterol lowering medications for cancer is a bigger risk factor than obesity, than diabetes, than hypertension, than cholesterol, than diet, than deprivation, than alcohol. And for all-cause mortality, cholesterol-lowering medication is number 6 on the list, higher than diabetes duration, diabetes type, diet, alcohol, physical activity, high blood pressure. Almost pretty much combined, they're still lower than cholesterol-lowering medication. So, is this the smoking gun that people are looking for to say that LDL cholesterol doesn't matter? No, it's not. I can't say that. They looked at LDL cholesterol of less than 2.5. They didn't look at LDL cholesterol of 10, 15, 20. They looked at below 2.5. That's probably why it's not a big risk factor. But I think really actually the takeaway from this needs to be the LDL cholesterol was not the problem here. It was the cholesterol lowering medication, which is basically a bigger risk factor for all-cause mortality than many things, a bigger risk factor for cancer mortality than things like obesity, which we know is a huge risk factor, a bigger risk factor for CVD mortality than hypertension and deprivation, which we know are huge risk factors, and for other mortality, again, bigger than alcohol and diet, which we know are huge risk factors. So is cholesterol the problem here? Don't know. Is cholesterol lowering medication a problem? Well, look, this UK Biobank trial would appear to say yes, it might be a problem, and it probably is increasing all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, cancer mortality, and basically every other mortality going. So next time your doctor wants to put you on a statin, maybe just ask them about this study. Ask them what your Q diabetes risk is. Q diabetes, if you didn't know, I'll put a link in the episode description, basically is an online calculator for determining your risk of diabetes. And pretty much if you add a statin, it will go up by about 1.5 to 2.5% for most people. So it's increasing the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Ask them what your MESA calculator score is. We can use things like calcium scores to determine whether statins are actually going to be of benefit for someone or not in terms of cardiovascular risk. I do this fairly regularly. I'm still yet to see a patient where the MESA calculator has suggested that statins are lowering their risk. Every single time the risk is increased. This study might give us an idea why. Thanks, guys, for listening to this episode of the Meat Medic podcast. I see you in the next one.